The varus or Teutoburg disaster. You've probably heard about it. And what I want to do is give you some challenges against some of the preconceptions that float around it. And these are drawn largely from an excellent talk I had. I had 2 talks with Dr. Joe Ball on my podcast, The Ancient History Hound. You can go and find it. It's called Teutoburg Disaster with Dr. Joe Ball, and also from reading her book on varus, which if you want to skip that, just read the book. The book is absolutely fantastic. So anyway, here are some of those things I'd like to challenge. First up, it was an ambush. Yes, it was an ambush, but when you think about an ambush, you think of a singular event, and this wasn't. This lasted up to 3 days and was formed of a series of events. Obviously, there were ambushes involved, but the idea that it was a one-off event that happened very quickly and was over and done with, no, not the case. Now let's talk Varus. Varus was the person in charge. He was the Roman governor. He was, again, in charge of those 3 Roman legions who were marching back from summer base to their winter headquarters. So ultimately, he does get the blame, and that's fair enough. I mean, that's what he's there. He's the person in charge. However, many of the criticisms seem to be not necessarily founded as well as you might think, and these come largely from later historians. First up then, Varus was inexperienced, he was out of his depth, he shouldn't have been there. Not really the case. He was appointed by Augustus, and he had a really good track record. This was a guy who'd been around. He'd been in different parts of the empire, dealing largely troubleshooting. You put him in an area, you asked him to get on with it, and he did a job. He could do very well on the battlefield, as he had done. He had lots of military experience, but he was also good at diplomacy, with working sometimes with very different and, shall we say, antagonistic actors. The second one is that he was stupid. I mean, he fell for the obvious thing. Arminius was obviously going to betray him. Everyone was telling him that. And again, that's not really the case. So Arminius was the chief instigator. He was the one who betrayed Varus. He was the one who was leading the Cherusci tribes and apparently some of the other loosely associated Germanic tribes, though again, his role actually in the whole thing isn't as clear as you might think. And one of the criticisms is that people were telling Varus all the time, don't trust this guy. So when he comes up with this different way home from that summer base, he takes it and doesn't question it. And everyone's telling him, that's a bit shady. However, the only person who's criticising Arminius and saying he's not to be trusted is his father-in-law. And his father-in-law and Arminius did not get on. So this could easily be put down to a sort of family squabble, which, let's face it, if you're someone who's dealing with high-end politics, as Varus had been, he would have seen lots of times. The third one to do with Varus is that he just fell apart. So immediately when things went bad, he didn't know what to do, he was out of his depth. And again, this can be challenged. So both through the finds, and again, Dr. Ball outlines this brilliantly in the podcast episodes, but also in her book, she talks about how the Romans kept together. They formed a camp on that first night, which is pretty important. And after that, they were able to keep their wounded with them. So initially, they get rid of the baggage train because that's going to slow them down, but they're able to transport their wounded. So this wasn't a Roman fighting force that had completely dissolved. It eventually does, but then it's been put under huge pressures, perhaps unlike any a Roman army or legions had experienced before. And even then, his men try and cremate him on the battlefield. So there's this idea of respect. His men didn't think he was that bad. And needless to say, some of the criticisms that you come under, I don't think are fair in that regard. He did and was able to keep a relatively tight Roman fighting force intact for as long as he could. Because after all, he was doing a sort of Roman Kobayashi test, At some point, this was all going to fail, given the pressures that him and his men were under. Just a couple of points on Varus and, in fact, Arminius. So, with Varus, we sometimes get the idea that he had brought this on himself. The reasons all those tribes were rebelling was because he was too harsh, he didn't know how to deal with them properly, all of that kind of stuff. Well, that wasn't really his decision. What he was doing was affecting Augustan policy. So Augustus was telling him what to do. He just did it. And it has been argued, and I think quite effectively, that really the blame lies more with Augustus. But Varus obviously is a good scapegoat because no one wants to blame the emperor. And finally, something about Arminius, which actually tells us about Rome itself. So Arminius isn't given a great deal of credit for this, which is really unusual when you think about it. And in fact, you can hear on the podcast, you can hear Dr. Joe Ball talking about that, or you can read her book, and she goes into it in beautiful detail, though it is a bit macabre at points, just how well set up the Germanic tribes were for this. they were well drilled, they knew what to do, and they even had an area set up where they sort of corralled the Romans toward in those last couple of days. And these had fortifications set up waiting for them. So they were being herded into I don't know if I can say the word here, but a particular type of zone that wasn't particularly healthy for the Romans. And all of this is to the credit of the Germanic forces, the barbarians. But of course, Roman historians don't like doing that. They're not going to give those guys too much credit. So it's much easier to kind of denigrate the one guy who's already been denigrated for a while anyway. So you can just, blame him, blame Varus. That was all his fault. Nothing to do with the Germans actually being pretty good.